Hello, everybody. I'm Grandmaster Joel Benjamin. Welcome to ICC's recap of the Tata Steel Masters tournament from Wijk aan Zee in the Netherlands. In today's video, we will cover rounds 1 through 4. There's a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to try to hit the highlights of the games from these rounds. Now, any tournament that Magnus Carlsen is participating in is going to be one of the main storylines, and he's had a pretty interesting start to the tournament. And we're gonna take a look at his game from the first round against the young grandmaster Esipenko, and Carlsen surprisingly missed a big opportunity in this game. So we're gonna run through the opening. I'm not going to spend too much time in the opening unless something really interesting happens in these games. The first interesting move is b6. Bishop d6 is certainly the most common move, but b6 is a line too. You'll notice this from Magnus. He doesn't avoid theory, but he very often does the second, third, fourth most popular thing just to make it a little bit more difficult for his opponent. So the game proceeds pretty normally through the opening. Tension in the center, and Esipenko decides to take, possibly giving the hanging pawns, which we're going to see in a little bit. There we go. The hanging pawns, not very nice term for those pawns, but they can be very dynamic, as we're going to see in a moment. And all this is very normal. Esipenko plays this move, bishop c3. This is actually a huge mistake. And Magnus does not spot it. He plays queen e7, after which we have a repetition of moves. White is now threatening to take the knight on d7, harassing the d5 pawn. So we had a repetition of moves and a draw like that. But instead, when we go back to move 17, after this move, bishop c3, Magnus could have played d4. And it's very surprising he didn't do it because it looks rather obviously like a strong move. Okay, first of all, if white takes the pawn, bishop takes knight. That's one of the main ideas of d4, opening this capture up. Pawn takes and knight d5. And yeah, the position is a little complicated, but it's clearly better for black. You would certainly expect Magnus to go for this. So if we go back to the position after d4, bishop a5, bishop takes knight. Now, white can't even try to take the rook on c7 because bishop takes d1, hitting the queen. Black just wins material. So he has to recapture. Then knight e5, hitting the pawn on f3. If white takes the rook, knight f3 check. Wherever you go with the king. It's not good. King g2. Black can give a check here, and can throw in the move queen a8. In fact, doesn't even have to take back. e4, knight takes e4 is strong. Yeah, okay, there's some calculation has to be done, but it certainly looks like everything is working out well for black. So to go back to this position after knight e5, if something like queen e2, queen e8, and white might not even get the exchange, like he could defend, say king g2, then black can just play rook c6 and move the rook. Or e4, knight h5 is very strong, knight coming into f4. This is a very surprising missed opportunity for Carlsen. He would have had just a tremendous position after d4. And, maybe it's a little bit opening round jitters, not yet being in form yet. Carlsen didn't go for it. So that was a big missed opportunity in the first round, but there were a number of decisive games from the first round. J.K. Duda beat Richard Rapport, sacrificed a pawn, got the d5, brought his king in, rather nice game. The Indian Grandmaster Vidit beat Shanklin in a long grinding endgame, and Van Foreest, Jordan Van Foreest triumphed over Niels Grandelius after Grandelius could not quite follow up his pawn sacrifice in the opening. It could have been a lot of decisive games in that first round. Shakhyar Mamedyarov was completely winning against Dubov after Dubov played a very dubious sacrificial opening, but went wrong, and so that game was drawn. But a very, very fighting first round. Good start to the tournament, and it's a tournament with a lot of enterprising players, maybe second level players. Those guys are maybe the most interesting to watch because, as we see, that they do a lot of very interesting things in the opening. All right, we're going to move on to the second round, and we're going to visit with Magnus Carlsen again, and we're going to see him get on the board with a win against Anish Giri. So he goes for d4, and it's Catalan. A position we've seen tens of thousands of times before. Queen c2 is the most main move, but knight a3 is an interesting alternative. And if you haven't seen it before, it's not at all a new move. In fact, I played this move in 1989 against Walter Brown. So it's been around for a long time, but leads to very double-edged positions because black usually takes this knight, otherwise it just recaptures seamlessly the pawn on c4. So double pawns, but two bishops. Bishop d7. And now the standard move is knight e5. Carlsen plays a4. This move almost doesn't appear in the database. So again, Carlsen trying something a little bit different to put his opponent off his game. That pawn at a4 is very weak, and Carlsen is prepared to sacrifice it. And here we go. He lets him take it. Queen b3. And now Giri should just retreat the knight to b6 out of harm's way, and white has compensation for the pawn. The engine says not enough, but of course engine doesn't play the game. But in any case, knight b6 was a better choice, and queen d5, very forcing move. But the problem with queen d5 is this very nice sacrifice by Carlsen. Rook takes c6. And although black is still okay after this, now he has to find very accurate moves. So put a lot of pressure on black with this sacrifice. Queen takes. All right, he's trying to stay on the knight. Of course, if black takes the queen on b3, the pawn recaptures, and then white's going to win material. So he has to take with the queen. Knight e5, queen b5, queen c2. So problems for black. This knight on a4 is loose, and white also has ideas of taking the pawn on b7. Now, the way out for black seems to be knight b6, bishop takes b7. Okay, that's hitting the rook. Also ideas of bishop c6, ideas of queen takes c7, and then the move knight c4, which hits this bishop on a3 and also attacks the bishop with the queen. After bishop takes rook, knight takes a3, and the engine says this comes out equal. A long variation, a hard variation to calculate accurately, even if you see the idea. So certainly understandable that he went wrong there. But so instead of finding the move knight to b6, knight d5 was played, and now the big problem is that the queen gets shunted off to the side on a5, and it's hard to defend the knight. Now here, bishop e4 is apparently a strong move, hitting the pawn on h7, actually threatening a mate 2, arguably better than bishop takes d5, the most natural move that Carlsen played, because now black probably should take with the queen and give up the knight. Position is bad. He could take the pawn on a2, but maybe not lost. 2 pieces for a rook. But you know, Giri played in a principled manner, holding on to the piece. But after rook b7, now bishop b4 is a huge threat. And he played c5 to stop that, but now his second rank is open, and white gets a winning attack. Here, Giri played rather humorously queen d8, but he spits on the queen, and Carlsen just maneuvers towards the winning endgame. The c pawn is just dominant. And now if knight takes e2, he could end up getting mated on the long diagonal, so he blocks it. Knight comes over to get the rook. If knight takes pawn check, something like this, white can just simply take and bring the king. And eventually going to be a winning pawn end. Yeah. So he played king g6, king f1, and they just liquidated it into this position. White is up a bunch of pawns, probably going to win the a pawn as well. So Geary resigned. So Carlsen getting on the board with the win in the second round, and a couple of other interesting games in the second round I want to look at. Richard Rapport bounced back from the first round with a win over Van Foreest, and he did it in the end game. And a very kind of surprising lapse by the Dutchman in that game. So I'm going to power through this opening. Not that it's boring, but can't get into everything. So we're going to get to the ending. We're going to see lots of trades, lots of trades. And now we see a knight ending, basically symmetrical pawn formation. This is where the modern rules, where they discourage players or sometimes prohibit players from making early draws. This is where it really pays off, because this game does not end in a draw. And f5, that's maybe a mistake. Maybe black should play more restrained with f6, not create any weaknesses. Still, the position is within the draw range. And it remains that way until this surprising decision by black after e4 to play knight to d7. Now, he can take, and you guys probably know how much I love the liquidation in the pawn end into the pawn ending. But here black can play king e7. And I guess it's possible to be afraid of this ending, but actually it's not winnable for white. Even if Van Foreest was afraid of that, he could have at least tried knight h5 in this position, which would not give up material. But the strange move knight d7, white just simply took a pawn, and I'm not sure what that e5 was about. White just had a material advantage, and he nursed it without too many problems. He keeps some, extra pawns on the board. On the queen side, king c5, the king coming to b5, and it's over. So those fundamental pawn endings are very important. Maybe that one will show up in a future edition of Liquidation on the Chessboard. Never know. And I want to just look briefly at a game which shows the fertile mind of Mamedyarov, because this opening is just out of this world. What he plays against Esipenko. I back in the day, I wrote some articles for New in Chess magazine. I talked about the prevalence of G4 in the opening, and this is an extreme example. The pawn can be captured. I think that Magnus said that he would snap that thing off. And now the engine recommends move f5, which is maybe a little bit more accurate than something like knight f6, e5, knight g8, and white hopes that the momentum as well as the g file will give some edge there. But Esipenko plays d5, very principled move. I should say about this g4, it's not exactly a novelty, but it's never been played by a strong international player. And this bishop g2, for what it's worth, is a novelty. The position has only occurred 3 or 4 times, but it just does not look good for white. He moves the king to avoid losing the pawn on g5. Esipenko retreats, and clearly Black is happy with this opening, and there's many other things he could have done, but what he did was certainly fine. Maybe a little bit too cautious. G6 is probably a little too bold, and this is where he could have had an advantage, I think, by playing bishop takes h4 with the idea of bishop g5, just keeping pieces on the board, and the white king is definitely more compromised. But instead of bishop h4, Esipenko just played maybe a little bit too respectfully, just headed to the end game, and was basically an equal ending. Mamedyarov got his weaknesses protected. It's a equal position. They agreed to a draw. So it's certainly a crazy game from the second round. Mamedyarov, sometimes you have these ideas and you just got to know how they turn out. But that one maybe should have been saved for a blitz tournament. Okay, let's move on to round 3, and we're going to start by seeing how Vidit brought himself into the lead with a win over Dubov. And this was a game, was a tight battle for a long time, coming out of Gioco Piano, Italian game, but we haven't seen that much of this in this event. The early bishop g5 trying to, create something, knight a3. Dubov is one of those young enterprising players who do anything in the opening. Van Voorhees is certainly like that, Richard Report, and they really kind of breathe fresh air into these events with all the crazy things they do. Knight a3 is a move you see in the opening, but usually not allowing the double pawns. So the game got very wild. The knight retreats to try to deal with the pin, and he ends up playing g5 anyway, which is kind of interesting, grabbing pawn. Just a great fight here. Black king in the center, but up a pawn. And in a moment, we're going to have a spectacular move, rook takes b7. So after knight takes b7, we would see bishop b5 check, and Black doesn't have a good answer to this. If bishop d7, rook takes e4, wins the queen. King d8, knight c6 check. King f7 is relatively best, but after knight takes f5, white certainly has enough compensation for that exchange. So instead, he did not take the rook. And kind of just shrugged it off with the move rook f6. And now Dubov really should have just retreated that rook b5, for instance, just not sacrifice anything. He has a better position. He probably went a little bit overboard with queen b1, which does not seem to actually offer more than equality. And Black is defending everything. That rook d8 was rook d1 was perhaps an important in-between move to clear the d8 square for the king. And now white has all these checks, which he executes. And this is where Dubov went wrong. He has this fantastic move, queen c8 check. And if king takes rook, there's queen g4 check. King d5, queen c4 check. Look at this checkmate. That's a beautiful checkmate. I think they call that an epaulette mate with the rook and the queen preventing the king from getting out. So that's really fantastic. After this queen c8 check, if rook e6, white goes rook e3, and Black is just pinned up. White is better in this position. The pin is a real problem for Black. So what would happen is Black would just have to retreat the king, and then we would see perpetual check. Would be a very unusual ending to the game, very unusual perpetual check, but half a loaf is better than none. And that was an important half point for Vidit, who is the leader through 4 rounds by virtue of this and the aforementioned win against Shanklin in the first round. Okay, so let's move on to Esipenko against Karyakin, and this is a game that had a very weird moment in it. It starts off fairly normally, and I actually kind of like the way that Esipenko played it. Again, it's another Gioco Piano, and he plays to get an early d4. He has to lose a little time retreating the bishop, but now he brings the knight out. And I like that knight b5. It's kind of an unstereotyped approach, this move, because you certainly expect the knight to go to c4. But this is very interesting. After a little repetition, he plays c4. Just ideas that I've never really seen in this opening. And he eventually gets a better game out of it. So Karyakin loaded up on that diagonal, but by giving back the pawn, now Esipenko is able to play to roll the kingside pawns forward. And here he starts to get some edge with that. And they go into the end game. And yeah, it's a nice looking position for white, but there are a whole lot of moves black can play. Bishop c8, bishop e6, rook e7 perhaps is the most normal. And white is squeezing, but can he win? Who knows? Karyakin just totally miscalculated with this rook b8. A really kind of surprising lapse there, because this piece sacrifice just doesn't work in a whole number of ways. And the engine points out the simplest refutation would be just to go bishop d3 and give back the pawn. I don't think that black really has any alternatives along the way. Just give the pawn back, and at the end you can protect everything. And white not only has an extra pawn, black's pawn structure is just all shattered. There's a lot of weaknesses there, and white is going to easily clean up in this endgame. So bishop d3 was the easiest. Instead, Esipenko retreated everything and tried to consolidate, and he has every expectation of being able to do so. But here black can still fight here, but he makes another mistake. Karyakin gets his rook trapped on the wrong side, and now that rook cannot help on the defense of the queen side. And after the move e5, we see that white is getting ready to play bishop e4, and after that the a2 pawn can't be defended, so black is going to have to give up one of his passed pawns in the next couple of moves, and with the lost position. So kind of a jettison by Karyakin. He might possibly have lost anyway, but rather surprising decision there, leading to win for Esipenko. I want to conclude round 3 by looking at a wild game between a Grandelius and Rapport. This is a Sicilian, and these guys go at it. Grandelius, I think, is not quite as strong as some of these other young players in the event, but certainly has great fighting spirit. And this was a very interesting Sicilian, a Taimanov variation with a very early g4 without a knight in f6. This does happen occasionally in the Sicilian, and eventually the knight does come out and it leads to a normal type of English attack. This f4, very provocative move. Black can, of course, take this pawn on g4. He can also play the move bishop b4 with the sacrificing the knight to take on e4, and seems to be favored by the engine, although engines don't play these games. So Rapport played the maybe more human move, knight c4, and white sacrifices that pawn because 2022 pawns don't really count that much. And report looks to put his king to safety on the queen side, and the position is probably fairly balanced. All right, that's he gives up the bishop here because the idea is that queen takes e4, rook takes c2, utilizing the pin, and that's strong for black. So he plays b3, but watch those dark squares because now he has to be careful. And here we go. This is a huge moment in the game. Grandelius goes wrong. He has the move f takes e6. Very important in-between move. And the first point is rook takes g3, e takes d7. It's no good for black because he's either going to take the rook or get knight c6 check in. So black has to recapture, but either recapture, there's the same kind of issue in that after rook takes g7, now white's next move is rook takes f7, and that will threaten checkmate on b7. So black does not have time to do what he did in the game. And it would be pretty much the same if f takes, rook takes g7, again, threatening to clean out that second rank. So black, can play a rook to c7. He's okay in the position, but black would not have the win that he did in the game. So rook takes g7 turns out to be a howler because rook h3, and now we have a fantastic finish. Black is threatening queen c3, so he guards it with queen e1, and now a decoy, deflection, whatever you want to call it, rook h1, it's a beautiful move. If white takes the queen, rook takes d1, doesn't even win a rook, that's actually back rank mate. And if queen takes rook, queen to c3, unstoppable mate. And you see, of course, the point is the second rank, did not get open in time. So after rook h1, I think he tried rook g1, which didn't really make any difference, takes. And here, knight c6 check black, and just take the knight and guard against the queen coming in. So after queen c3, Grandelius resigned. A fantastic finish to the game. It's always nice to have a little bit of flash. All right, so now we're going to move on to the fourth round and revisit with Magnus Carlsen, who missed another opportunity, and this was really fantastically complicated, this game against Van Foreest. Again, not going to spend that much time on the opening. Magnus made a very sort of proper draw against Duda in the third round, and that brought us to this game. Now, I have gotten this type of position with black a number of times, the line I like in the King's Indian. He ultimately gives up the bishop. That's white's strategy, is to win this bishop, but now this kind of stonewall formation, knight c5, that's a cute move, by the way. He gets a stonewall giving up his bad bishop, and now he's got this nice play going on the king side. So I really like how Van Foreest played the early part of the game. And now we see this pawn sacrifice on g4, but giving up the f file and a lot of light squares. It's a bold move. Carlsen wanting to win. And so now we see g4, and white can play h3 if allowed. So he tosses another pawn on the fire. And apparently rook f3 was the better move here. Now white has the advantage, but still it looks very precarious with the king so exposed, the bishop on e1 not doing all that much. Carlsen played rook b2. This move surprises me that he doesn't play king f1, which would give him, more options. The king really has to get off of that g file. If bishop takes g5, rook b1, similar to what played in the game, would be strong for white. It's also possible to take the bishop, but that would be less clear after black could actually take with the rook on g6 and try to kind of block out the queen with various moves of the with the rook coordinating on the open files. The move, what really surprises me about the move rook b2 is that black can take on g5 with the rook. I'm not really sure why Magnus allowed this, because it seems like, you know, black is certainly in no danger opening up the king like that. He has various perpetual checks. The position is probably equal. But Van Foreest went for more with bishop takes. Maybe Carlsen was thinking of that as a little bit of a trap. King f1, queen a7, and now Magnus goes wrong with queen g4. He can again play king e2, running out, and he's still going to get the bishop and hide his queen, run out with his king. Eventually, the king has actually got some nice protection from the bishop in the middle of the board. It's going to be white's going to be winning. But after queen g4, black manages to turn the table somewhat. Plays queen a6 check. Okay, the king went back to g1. He didn't really want that, but he thought attacking the rook on g6 is loose. It's going to be okay. But it doesn't. And I think by now Magnus has seen what he overlooked. Rook g7. c5 actually was also possible with a similar idea, defending the rook. And now what? If queen takes rook, and I don't know if this is what Carlsen missed, bishop f4 check, what a lovely move. Taking away the h2 square, not just flat out checkmates. So that's a non-starter. He cannot take the rook. You know, so what can he do? He can play like in the game, rook b8 check, but bishop t8, nice retreat, takes. And now king h7 would run into rook d7, a very nice move, pinning the pinner. But black can instead play rook f8. That's what happened. And now Magnus had to sacrifice his queen. a3, and this, of course, creates a fortress. So his miscalculation doesn't cost him a full point. And that's that. It's a fortress. The bishop defends all the pawns here. The rook, you know, rook can come up to the third rank if he wants. It's an easy draw. So so Carlsen not managed to win that. And of course, is that gives him 2.5 out of 4. What else from the round 4? Mamedyarov Duda. This could potentially be a big game. Again, missed opportunity for Duda, as he went wrong deep into the game. First of all, a real 21st century opening. This has become fairly common. This c takes d4 was just considered to be a bad move for so long. But this variation has become popular at the grandmaster levels. I don't know if it's caught on quite that much with lower levels. I don't know if that's so easy for the club players to play with their king in the center. But the idea is that black, okay, has control of the dark squares, and he has things going for him. King b1, otherwise rook c8 pinning could be a problem. So I'm going to get to critical moments soon. Rook d8. White maybe does not have enough compensation here after black simply takes the pawn. But Mamedyarov trying to attack. That's his aggressive player. Here, knight takes f5, runs into rook takes c2, and then the knight and f5 hangs. Rook e3, so takes, rook takes g3. He does not go for that, and so piece sacrifice. Rook takes c2. He has to get rid of that bishop. Now black has two pieces for rook. White only has one pawn. Does not look impressive for black, but Duda just really goes very wrong from here. Move bishop c5 is inaccurate. Probably rook h7 is the strongest. Black just has to make sure to coordinate his pieces. But bishop to c5 puts the bishop into danger. After g4 check, I think black should take that en passant, still staying out of danger, but maybe a drawish position. King g5 is a bold decision, as after f4 he has to give him a piece. Now he could have done it with king takes g4, and now either rook to e6, he can play bishop to d4. Now here's a very entertaining computer line. Rook d6, this is not forced, but it's kind of fun. King d3, h2, king takes d4, threatening rook f6 mate. Yeah. Rook to d8. Ooh, okay. So getting ready to queen. And so let's say king e3, with the idea if you take the rook, rook g5 check and rook h5, rook e8 check. Can't go to f3 because you queen with check. So you have to go back to the d file, and then we can have repetition rook d8. So that's a very funny line. But he sacrificed the bishop instead, as we see when knight takes f4. And black is still kind of okay in this position, but he has to play accurately. It was not really good to go into the sacrifice. I think h3 immediately was stronger, even rook h7. Yeah, this is a very bad combination of moves. And now it's big trouble. He gets behind the pawn. King b3 is a nice move, and Duda just sees the position is hopeless because this rook can retreat now. He's got the h pawn under control. One possible variation is rook e8, and then white can simply take the pawn in h2. And it's a winning ending, not only with an extra pawn, but with the black king very far cut off. So really unforced error for Duda, I guess, trying to win that. I went from a better position to a lost position pretty quickly, and that may haunt him as the tournament goes on. Also in this round, Pragnananda, the young Indian prodigy, got his first win of the event over Grandelius. This is kind of a nice game, exploiting a big advantage on the light squares. So what's the general story after 4 rounds? Well, there's one name that I haven't mentioned at all so far, and that's Fabiano Caruana. And Fabi seems to be kind of stuck in World Championship match mode in this event. He's playing for very small margins, and he did get big winning chances in the first round against Karyakin. There was a moment when he had a significant advantage before he went wrong and the game equalized. But basically, he's been getting very quiet positions, playing for very small advantages, and this is a markedly different approach than we're seeing from a lot of the young guns and not so young guns like Mahajarov in this event. So far, Caruana has nothing but draws, and we've seen some other players go up and down. Karyakin has not shown very much so far. Sam Shanklin struggling a bit out of the gate. But as I said, Vidit, the youngish Indian player, he's not like most of the other players I mentioned. I'd say he has a more conventional sort of squeeze it out style, take advantage of mistakes. And those 2 wins without a loss has put him in first place. Magnus Carlsen, who certainly could have had more points, is in that chasing pack at +1. And I'd say the tournament's off to a very good start. There have been a few short draws in the event. I mean, you can always contrive a repetition. There was a repetition draw that Karyakin went right into at the opening with white against Giri, which probably did not go over very well. But a lot of really good fighting chess. And I look forward to bringing you continuing coverage of this event. I will have updates at regular intervals on the off days as they come along, and should be a lot of fun watching the progression of this tournament. Once again, I'm Joel Benjamin, ICC's recap of the Tata Steel tournament from Vikensee, Netherlands. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you'll be back for our future videos.